Good afternoon. Welcome to the Representations in Media panel, and it is really truly an honor to be, at the table with these other luminaries on the topic. I should say, we have a relationship with media in which somehow racism is located at the side of the individual, but then somehow institutions and regimes of representation in the media get a free pass. It's not, this can't be racist in some capacity. And I believe in the last 20 years, and media studies have shifted the bar on that, but there's a lot of ground to still be covered. At this point, I would just say, and I'm Professor Evan Torner, Assistant Professor in German Studies, I will just introduce the panelists, and we will then give them each their 20 minutes at time to present their insights on how these economic and racial relations are then mediated, and these then turn into domestic and scientific realities, as it were. So the first presentation will be by Aniko Imre from the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. Again, you have extensive biographical information in this program, and I will say I'm just sitting next to people who have written multiple books on all of these subjects, so these are absolute experts. This will be followed by Ronald Jackson II, who is sitting here to my right. So Aniko is in the middle, then Ron Jackson, and then finally Valerie Weinstein, and both Ronald Jackson is at the University of Cincinnati, as well as Valerie Weinstein's also at the University of Cincinnati. Ron Jackson's in communications, Valerie Weinstein's in women, gender, sexuality studies, as well as a former colleague from German studies. And without further ado, Aniko Imre.
Starting the clock.
Yep.
Thank you very much to the organizers for making me go up after Cheryl Harris. Always dreamed of doing this. But seriously, Sonny and Felix and the entire team, I'm just thrilled to be here, and congratulations on putting on such an important venue. It's really an opportunity to, for so many things. Let me just say, first of all, that I'm in media studies, and I feel like fish out of water at this conference, which is a really good thing, because it allows you to defamiliarize some of your assumptions and certainly methodologies. Not a single clip so far. Where are the clips? But really, it's a great opportunity. It's given me an opportunity to think about how race relations have changed, particularly in my preferred area of study, which is Europe at large, but more specifically the post-socialist region. And this is something, thinking about race in terms of whiteness and white supremacy in the post-socialist region, is something I've been doing pretty consistently for the past 10, 15 years. But it seems like the events of the last couple of years have changed everything. And I think we're here to evaluate these changes in a transnational context. So I wrote up something in the past couple of days, which I rewrote this morning in the light of every single presentation. I rethought something. And forgive me if I don't sound as coherent as I had planned to be, because I just want to engage in the conversation and maybe throw out some things that I might be working out on the fly here. So I wanted to originally still want to talk about the relationship between, and this is going to be an overgeneralization, the popular and the populist. Popular media representations, this is our charge on this panel, and the turn to populism. And the representation, of course, is always about the relay between aesthetic representations, textual representations, and the kind of legal political representation that most of you are in the business of analyzing. And I've been thinking about the problems with representation as well, back when it started in the 1960s as a kind of outgrowth of the political outcomes of cultural studies and popular media studies. The project was to make everyone aware, you know, from the academy, from academia outwards, that representations actually carry ideological power. And these are in some sort of relationship to actual relationships of power and hierarchies with deep consequences for fixing certain minorities in their place. And they are absorbed, these representations are absorbed mostly unconsciously through popular media in these depoliticized formats. And the more depoliticized, the more closely associated with entertainment, the more effective this interpolation is. So the project was to call attention to these processes, taking into account psychoanalysis and critical theory from adjacent disciplines. And by now, we're kind of at the end of this process where we don't have to argue for the power of representation. Certain representations that might appear on TV associated with celebrities can actually affect political movements. In a way, the other side of this, that we might take representations for granted. Reading representations, and one sees it in academia, but also in activism around representational politics. Reading and criticizing representations, pointing out how they are wrong, becomes an end in itself. It often becomes kind of a self-serving game. And of course, it can also be, and it is often, recapitulated in the service of marketing to identify certain demographics as desirable minorities. So it's full of compromises. And this to me, is a problem in my teaching and in my political commitments. So this is something, I don't have a solution for it, but I'd like to put this out there as the larger context for looking at transatlantic representations and their politics. It's as true in the United States as elsewhere. I would also like to talk about touch on many of the threads that have been kind of spreading around here this morning. The issues of whiteness and racism, particularly not just in Europe, but between East and West, that kind of historical tension between Eastern and Western Europe, particularly in the post-Cold War era. And just mention another really entrenched problem that is very closely related to the East-West issue and pivots around racism, is the symbiotic relationship between nationalism and cosmopolitanism that has been at the core of the kinds of virulent nationalisms that have sprung out of the post-socialist moment. And I think this relationship has changed a great deal, and tracking and understanding these changes might help us understand the nature of racism. I think Matthias talked about this earlier. One of my hobby horses is the loss of socialism as something that we should be bemoaning a bit. And I'm thinking about Deborah mentioned it in the Q&A, that we need to find better models, because even the liberal models are fundamentally bound up in these racist paradigms that we're criticizing. And they are deeply flawed, they are deeply neoliberal. There is really no alternative to neoliberalism. And there were alternatives in socialism, this kind of defunct paradigm that's just now disappeared, erased from the face of the earth. And so I'd like to maybe just call for a concerted effort to re-examine socialism as a possible model, notwithstanding its failure. And there is, in fact, a thriving research field, I hope it's thriving, around going back to the archives and understanding socialism not as a model, not necessarily on the large scale, but socialism as a lived experience. So I'm probably out of time, and I've just gone through the introduction. These were just the notes I wrote up. Okay, so until the end of the 1990s, discussions of race as a critical and theoretical category had been deemed largely irrelevant to understanding the histories and political changes in the post-socialist countries of Eastern Europe, Eastern and Southern Europe. This blindness to the power of race appears to be a stunning naivete in the light of the eruption of the neo-Nazi and anti-Semitic sentiment that we're witnessing today and the concerted attacks on Roma populations. The logic was that you can't really have racism when you don't have a variety of races. I mean, I'm laughing, it's because it's laughable. When you only have whiteness, and these populations have been fairly homogeneous, they still are. And especially in the relative isolation, when it comes to media representations, relative isolation of socialist regimes, there really wasn't too much exposure to racial diversity. It was kind of a white bubble. So, of course, this logic ignored what we know is that whiteness is a racial category and can't be treated as transparent. But this logic also rendered Roma minorities a non-race by definition, and we heard quite a bit about this, how other categories, adjacent categories were borrowed to, such as ethnic, which is in Eastern Europe is often treated as a synonym of national. These were borrowed to erase the violence of racism. And I wrote earlier that I think the situation has changed a great deal, but this morning we found out that, in fact, it probably hasn't. One of the reasons for the change has been the expansion of post-colonial studies into Eastern Europe, and the discovery of, and gradual, reluctant, creaking acceptance of the relevance of post-colonial studies in relation to post-socialism. Because post-colonial studies provided historical parallels and conceptual models to prove what we take for granted now, is that whiteness, white supremacy actually thrives in a white environment. And it is this racial underpinning is essential to sustaining nationalism's binary logic of us versus them. So not participating directly in colonial ventures and thus not absorbing large post-colonial non-white populations in these home countries facilitated rather than prevented the adoption of racist ideas. And these discourses were embedded in the European Enlightenment and the rationality of the European Enlightenment. I also called attention to a kind of colonial mimicry that these populations have long performed that's embedded in East European nationalisms, which exacerbated during the Cold War as these populations got shifted even further to the margins of Europe and farther away from the desired European center. It's a kind of unconscious, ongoing attempt by these populations to assimilate to the core through asserting a cultural commonality to distract from the shared platform of whiteness, which allows this cultural affiliation. And in the light of the keynote, this is obviously has layers and layers of history and does not exempt these populations even from a kind of vicarious, at least discursive participation in slavery. But definitely I'm going to think about issues of white coalition and the buffer class and how it changes the paradigm of white colonial mimicry in Eastern Europe. So my thinking was, and along with many others who welcomed the end of the Cold War, we thought that globalization, the opening of the borders, the availability of a wide variety of non-white images, a sharp increase in immigrant populations, visibility, exposure to non-whiteness might help recognize and perhaps tackle this kind of internalized racism by making it visible. Obviously, that's not what happened. But there was a moment in the 1990s when many of us looked at the proliferation of Roma representations, which seemed to give at least some ambivalent agency to Roma celebrities and activists and many others who connected aesthetic representation with political representation. So I just like to, am I controlling this somehow? English does not come up. Resistance, imagine Plastic Horvath, who is the winner of the Czech Idol. So many of the global television formats.
There you go.
I did this. Gave some prominence and visibility to Roma singers. This is a Hungarian singer. This is a two of them who made careers on the international stage. This is a Czech group, and all these performers, and by far my favorite, Aziz, who actually ran for parliament as the representative of the Euro-Roma party. So they had, a kind of political pull. This is a Romanian singer, the notorious Jessica, Hungarian singer, a really bad one, I think. But he had a reality program that was both controversial and extremely popular, and kind of normalized the Roma family as the Hungarian family. Again, ridden with contradictions. They had to do a great deal of self-exoticization, like with zebra stripes. Only a gypsy would do that. This was an animated film that was also made some waves internationally. That was produced almost entirely by Roma artists. So just a couple illustrations. This was the moment of optimism in the 1990s. And I latched onto these representations as the evidence of the changing status of the Roma, who were breaking away from those entrenched stereotype images of the victim, the exoticized noble savage, and took control over production into their own hands. Well, that optimism fizzled out, as we know. And yes, 5 minutes. I'm condensing. And really brought into question the inherent political power of popular representations. So let me just ask a couple of questions. How is it that these governments, these post-socialist governments, are able to launch such effective media campaigns against minorities, against migrants and immigrants, 3 decades after the end of socialist authoritarian regimes and the arrival of large-scale globalization, trade, media proliferation, the digitalization, and the internet? Shouldn't the connectivities and the networks of popular media, which are global and transnational, shouldn't they have established sufficient alternatives to diffuse and undermine post-socialist nationalistic hate-mongering? Shouldn't they have rendered Nazism, anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia more toothless, particularly in countries that were some of the main sites of the trauma of the Holocaust? How do we make sense of the contradictory relationship between the resurgence of nativist, xenophobic, populist nationalisms in Europe and the advancement of global digital media? Are the latter completely irrelevant if they can be so easily neutralized? And I think the answers have to do with a number of things, but one of them is the European Union's role in media regulation. So I just want to note the contradictions that media regulation has tried to bridge in Europe for the past 10, 15 years. When you look at the European media landscape, the borders have all but disappeared. The Union has adopted policies that actively facilitate transnational media expansion. There are still some remnants of protectionist measures for public service media, but the new European Audiovisual Media Services Directive, which inherited the charge of the Television Without Frontiers Directive, identifies as its main goal the creation of a digital single market. In other words, there is widespread access through streaming, digital media platforms, to almost any content. And borders are actively disappearing. On the other hand, we see this kind of retrenchment of parochial nationalisms, the drawing of borders and boundaries, and some of them are metaphorical, some of them are actual borders, to stave off the migration from the Middle East and North Africa. So this situation actually allowed a kind of decentralization of media control in post-socialist countries that is more than contradictory. It's unprecedented, and it's really hard to comprehend how in this age of decentralization and media globalization, particularly Europe, actively facilitated by the European Union, these governments, one after the other, have been able to recreate media networks that are centralized, that produce and disseminate propaganda, not unlike the Sinclair network or familiar from Fox News, but they are also very similar to late socialist networks. It's a kind of return to this kind of authoritarian structure, except it's much more effective. It's much more slick. It's borrowed neoliberal techniques of marketing, and this marketing and branding is transnational. It's aided by being outsourced to international companies, some of which are American conservative media firms and PR firms. It's a really a dangerous mechanism that created a system of what some refer to as paternalistic commercialism in the post-socialist landscape that's nationalized, that allows conservative governments to control their media borders and actually affect a great deal of influence on their population. So this is a very important factor in disseminating racist and xenophobic ideas without controls. Of course, linguistic isolation has a lot to do with this. A traditional, relatively low access to foreign languages, which is very different from Western Europe, and it affects some countries more than others. But it's not something that can be ignored. So I don't have very good news about the power of representation, but I don't think we should give up on the potential of progressive representations to intervene in entrenched racial relations. But the developments of the past 10 years in Eastern Europe foreshadowed what we have also recently learned here in the United States, is that in the absence of alternative models, with the demise of socialism as a world system, populist nationalism and the popular cultures of neoliberalism converge rather than conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Aniko. And now we turn to Ron Jackson's presentation.
I'll begin with a story, a Cherokee story. And in this narrative, the Cherokee grandfather is talking to his grandson. He explains that in this world, there are two wolves that are fighting. One wolf is all about denial, pain, greed, competition, hatred. Another wolf is about love, caring, and hope, and the capacity to be free. And then the grandson turns to his grandfather and says, well, which wolf will win? And his grandfather says, the one that we feed. It seems to me that when we think about the issue of race across the transatlantic, across the world, we can even say that there is a lot of feeding of these wolves. It's not very easy to just feed one wolf because there's pain, there's trauma that comes with race. And so you have to visit that aspect of the conversation just to get to the root of where we must go forward. And yet I find myself many days thinking about the fact that we are stuck, thinking about that we are enthralled in this dangerous public fantasy around race, and that this becomes localized in my world within higher education, within the academy. But I also think about, and I'm reminded of William Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, where Brutus turns to Ligurius and he says, surely there are those that are sick that we must make whole, but are there not also those that are whole that we must make sick? The conversation around race is one that traumatizes us. It sickens us. It creates a social contaminant that many of us find unbearable, to the extent that even locally, right here at the University of Cincinnati, that we find that it is often too risky to talk publicly about race and racism. Publicly in a real genuine, honest sense, in a sense that holds us accountable for where we must go next. And as a result, I've decided to visit that space today, not to necessarily feed that little wolf that talks about greed and pain, but also to think about how we must visit the other wolf that talks about hope and love. And so, we think more broadly, before I jump into the presentation, we think more broadly about Donald Trump. We've heard his name throughout this entire day so far. We've heard our keynote lecturer talk to us about Trump-isms and why she calls it that, knowing that there is no mastermind in Donald Trump around parochialism and anti-intellectualism. This has happened before. We've seen the privileged folks' musings of the underclass. This has happened before. And we know that who he is merely emblematic of a larger social problem, a kind of runaway totalitarianism that somehow has been gut-checked by a populace that's been enduring frequent and returning crises of unfreedom. But we are tired. And because we are tired, something must be done. Something must be done to help us to think about what Cornel West was talking about when he said that black people's humanity is a relatively new discovery of the West. So the public fantasies around race can be explored in three ways, and I want to look at those today. I think about Frantz Fanon, the author of Black Skin, White Masks, who asks in his discussion of identity, how do we actually hold ourselves accountable? And he says, well, one way is by asking ourselves three questions. Who are we? Are we who we say we are? And are we all we ought to be? And so in this presentation, I'll visit those questions, and I'll visit them as it relates to what I call a pretext, a text, and a context. The pretext being the set of conditions that allows us to be where we are. In other words, who are we? How do we constitute our sense of who we are in this moment? And that the text really is about, are we who we say we are? That even as an institution, even as institutions of higher education across the world, are we doing the work that we say that we want to do? That's the real text we need to visit. And then afterwards, I think we need to kind of also explore the context. And so it asks us that, are we all we ought to be? And so, who are we? Well, let's first kind of examine what that looks like. The mission of colleges and universities across the world, right, is all about trying to develop better global citizens. We also prepare ourselves for the workforce. We want to prepare our students for the workforce. And we find ourselves enthralled with this idea that we have the best educational system. We want to educate students to be better citizens by helping them understand something about the greater good, about serving the public interest. That's what we say we do. That's who we say we are. And we also think that we have a clear grasp on what inclusion looks like. We've defined it over and over again. We've talked about inclusion as something that is active and intentional, something that is engaging around the curriculum and the co-curriculum. We've talked about this as it relates to the intellectual, the social, and the cultural, as well as the geographical, and we continue to return to these kinds of conversations when we explore what we mean when we say inclusion, as the American Association of Colleges and Universities describes here. That's who we say we are. I guess the question I'm most curious about, though, is are we really true about what we're saying? So are we who we say we are? And so we can look at this question, and we can look at it in a couple of different ways. We can think about inclusive excellence as a conversation that's ongoing in our universities across the entire world. I'm going to focus our conversation today on those universities here in the United States, and we're going to focus it to issues of race. And when we talk about the universities in the United States that try to explore what inclusive excellence looks like, there are several different kinds of conversations that emerge, and some of them refer to faculty buy-in. You can't have it. You can't have inclusive excellence without it. Having a university strategic plan, having a diversity and inclusion course, having admissions accountability, buy-in, and then multiple resources to support this. Now, I bring us to this conversation because I feel that oftentimes one or two of these things is missing, maybe multiple of them are missing, and as a result, there's a continuing collapse of this conversation around inclusive excellence. I would even argue that we have no real model in the United States for what inclusive excellence looks like within higher education. And we struggle over and over again. And I feel like that it's a lot like what happens when you're driving down the expressway and you see an accident. And you have places to go, and so you choose to just ignore it and keep going. Within less than 60 seconds, you have forgotten the color of the vehicles. You don't know or care whether the person or any person there was hurt. You literally are just moving, manipulating, maneuvering around the accident and then going on about your business. You forget that it even is important in the first place. We have lost our connection to humanity. And I feel like that universities forget that they have to be inclusive. And as a result, we find over and over and over again these conversations that emerge around what excellence looks like. I'll come to some ideas, some examples in just a moment. But let's take, for example, this recent conversation that we had nationally around Colin Kaepernick and him taking a knee. Taking a knee during the national anthem was a really big risk for any athlete. And of course, he started a revolution, if you will, among different athletes across the country. But there were people who still had headlines that were saying, was he wrong for what he did? Was he wrong for even trying to protest the national anthem? And it's kind of funny in some ways because, those of us that are in the United States, we get inculcated at a very young age on what the Pledge of Allegiance is. If you know it, say it with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, right? So you look at this and you say, wow, okay, there's this one nation. We're not divided, it's indivisible, and it's liberty and justice for all. That's a beautiful idea, right? And we're taught to say this over and over again in elementary school. And so you grow up and you realize none of that is true, right? And so it becomes very, very, very disappointing. It becomes very frustrating because you're thinking, wow, if this is what our country does, is provide us with these myths around the idea of liberalism, that that the state is supposed to protect its citizens, right? And that it's necessary for the state to do so. But then you see over and over again news stories about individuals like Sam DuBose who are being shot and killed by police for stupid things like not having a front license plate. It begins to either gradually disintegrate your trust and your hope around what we're going to do pertaining to inclusive excellence. Racism, since August of 2016, you see on college campuses things like this happening all the time, the scrolling of the N-word. You see fraternities and sororities having parties where they're in blackface. You see them dressing up like persons that they think represent the underclass. You see this racist behavior happening all the time. Just this year, 2018. Let me remind you that it's only April, 13th or so? So just this year, in the last 4 months, the first 4 months of the year, we've already experienced at 5 different universities these racist musings. You can see it here, right? And these universities, Southern Methodist University, SUNY, Pitt, Oregon, and USC, are not just the only places where we see this stuff happening. It's just that they're the first ones that are being reported. In just a couple years ago, in around 2015, 16, you saw that there was just an outburst of campus racist acts happening, these racist violations happening at campuses all across the country. In fact, over 100 universities reported racial hate crimes or racism on the college campuses during that time frame. And you had protests, and individuals that were protesting, had different ways of doing so. Some of them had signs that say that I am not this stereotype. Some of them took to the streets. Some of them created social media campaigns. But think about it, in the last 3 years, over 100 universities in the United States have had protests against campus racism. And you know what's happening? Many of them have actually asked for some of the same basic things. A required diversity and inclusion course. Do you realize right now in the United States that there's very few universities that actually require a diversity and inclusion course? Most of them, in fact, actually have optional diversity and inclusion courses. They have a slate of courses that you can possibly take under a designation before you graduate, and some of their diversity courses are things like music of the Beatles. So, are we all we ought to be? Clearly not. Let's go back to this. There's various tried and true methods that are out here for trying to look at inclusive excellence. We know that it has to happen in the curriculum. It has to happen with the faculty and the students, and there has to be a way in which we teach around the issues of inclusion. Every time I think about the reason why I do work around race and social justice, it's mainly because I've been violently removed from the curriculum, right? It's not that I really want to talk about this stuff, because this stuff it presents a lot of emotional labor, right? I would much rather be doing something fun and exciting. But this stuff is important, and if we don't talk about it, nothing's going to happen. And so we think about it. On our college campuses, even to this very day, right, this very moment, many of us teach our basic foundation courses, our intro courses, in a way that only acknowledges one particular kind of epistemology, right? It's mostly about the Greeks and the Romans, and then when you finish with them, then we talk about other whites and other Europeans, right? Until we've exhausted them, and then we say, okay, we can mention one or two people of color. And that's it. There's a limit. We can't go too far. And so therefore, our students leave not prepared for a global workforce, not prepared to enter into a space where they understand fully that other individuals besides whites participate in intellectual work, right? We don't really know that. And as a result, we find ourselves stuck. We know that in the United States, that the United States is becoming increasingly more minority, more marginalized group, more darker, right? And in 2020, there's been predictions of a much higher Spanish population, but we also know that, Spanish-speaking population, but we also know that this is not necessarily something that is going to yield much more participation, more equality, more equity, right? Because we have to change the paradigm. So why do we keep missing the mark? That's probably a good question for us to ask ourselves. In 2015, the University of Cincinnati was provided a roadmap. And in that strategic diversity and inclusion roadmap, they were told that there were 5 themes they should address. These are the same 5 themes that should be addressed across the country. Themes such as having a requisite curriculum that actually is more inclusive. I'm actually working now for no reason that it's not like I really want to do this. I'm working on an intro public speaking textbook. I don't really want to do that. But I'm only doing it because at the basic foundation of our field, there has to be, and that is the course, that's the foundation, that's the entry point for our field, that there has to be someone who says, guess what? The people that existed before the Greeks and Romans, they had brains, right? They had an actual way of thinking that needs to be acknowledged, and that tradition, that set of traditions, needs to be part of the curriculum, that students should walk away having some knowledge of that. And so, having an accent on student success and faculty success and community engagement is very important as part of this. Now, we could talk about all these things all day. These are just solutions, required courses, integrating D&I in the curriculum and so forth. but it requires commitment on our part. And it means that each and every one of us who is in the classroom, who is actually teaching, has to say, okay, the moment that I begin to work on my syllabus for the next term, I'm going to have to integrate into the discussion, into the literature that my students are reading, a global set of readings from multiple different traditions that allows them to not just see the usual ways that we think about this particular topic. Even by simply quoting individuals, we begin the work of helping them understand that there are multiple individuals across the world besides whites that actually have a contribution to the world. So, I have a couple moments left in my presentation, and so I just want to say that, you know, we've seen the excuses happening over and over again. We have scientists that say we can't do it because how can you diversify science? We just tell the facts. Of course, they tell the facts about individuals who have produced work who are usually white, because the presumption is that they are the only ones who have the facts. And so you talk about these things and you think, wow, how do we actually get rid of some of these crazy excuses that are happening? And it means we have to attack them one by one. There's a lot of myths about diversity and inclusion courses. Some of them are myths that, you know, that suggest to us that every course is about competency. Not everyone is about competency. Not everyone has to be taught by one department, right? Not everyone has to actually have one particular plan. There can be multiple plans, multiple approaches, and multiple ways to consider this. But it seems to me that oftentimes we find ourselves stuck, and these myths are just another set of excuses, the renditions of the truth, right? And so, what can we do now? I think we have to redefine the classics. I think the media representations around racism across the world have led to us being stifled. We're stuck. And because we are stuck, we find ourselves constantly wondering, how do we actually get out of this? How do we get to a point where we can break free of this certain kind of stature around racism in the academy and beyond? And it means we have to reconsider our intellectual heroes. We have to reconcile the vocabulary we use. We have to introduce our students to cultural icons across disciplines. And we have to also train our students to be principally ethical global citizens. All of that has to happen sooner than later if we want to become universities, campuses that are who we say we are. So who are we? Are we who we say we are? Are we all we ought to be? These are three fundamental questions we have to answer. And the more honest we are, the better it is. We choose which wolf to feed. And I like to feed the one that's talking about hope, that's working toward us getting to a place where multiple traditions and canons, multiple individuals' lives are being respected and valued. That's the place, the academy, to which I like to belong.
Thank you. Our last speaker this afternoon is Valerie Weinstein.
So it's such a privilege and quite humbling to be here to speak after all of you. And I've just loved everything I've heard today and thought about so many connections between so many things. And wanted to begin with, well, on the surface, it seems like I'm an outlier here, right? Because so many of you have been talking about the post-Holocaust, right? And the Nazis are the bad object that all of the racisms are not, right? Whether it is German exceptionalism today or an American identity that needs the Holocaust Museum on the mall to show what not racists we are, or any Steve Bannon, who now loves Israel and therefore is not a racist, right? So one of the things that I think my paper happens to do when placed in this group, and is actually a big part of the project this is a part of, is to tie back to the first talk today, this kind of queers the time and place of racism, and saying that Nazism is not this sort of abject other and radically different, but looking at some points of alignment of Nazi racism and other racisms. And to do that, what I need to look at, and what my project is all about, is not looking at what we think we know about Nazi racism. That is not looking at the death camps, right, at the genocide of the Jews and the Roma and so on, but to look at the place where most of my German friends will insist there is no racism, which is to look at the popular culture of the Third Reich, which, as I misspoke, has been divided to good objects and bad objects, our favorite classic comedies that we see on TV on Sundays and so on. This presentation actually comes out of a book project, which I'll just sell for you to look out for in early 2019 from Indiana University Press, which is Anti-Semitism and Film Comedy in Nazi Germany. And I pulled a piece out of this that I think has a lot of connections to what's been said today. And because I want to make some of those connections, I'll probably be editing as I go in extemporizing. But in any case, people think of anti-Semitism in Nazi film as overtly hateful propaganda. And they think of, one of two or three films. And really, what my book is trying to do is to conceive of anti-Semitism entirely differently, which is to conceive of anti-Semitism as a more subtle process of defining and excluding Jewishness. Film comedy and anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany reveals how humor, coded hints and traces, absences, and substitutes in Third Reich film comedy helped spectators imagine an abstract Jewishness and a German identity and community that were free from that Jewishness. Film comedy's process of identifying and excising Jewishness was parallel and complementary to the mass murder of Jewish people in the Holocaust. The refugee crisis in Europe, the resurgence of populist nationalism and overt racism on both sides of the Atlantic compel us to rethink racism and prejudice in popular culture. Understanding the way anti-Semitism functions in Third Reich comedy helps us reconceptualize the relationships between film comedy, racism, and national identity in other contexts. Shared senses of humor promote communal identifications and erect symbolic boundaries between social groups. At the same time, laughter and ridicule discipline spectators, encourage normative behavior, and build community. Third Reich film comedies defined the differences and created distance between Germans and Jews. They taught racialized, gendered behaviors and encouraged spectators to conform. While most Third Reich film comedies separated imagined Jewishness from the German Volksgemeinschaft, which translates as a racial national community, today I want to talk about a Third Reich film comedy that both deployed racial codes of its era and attempted to trouble dominant paradigms of Jewish difference through the staging of a colonial fantasy. And this piece recurs throughout my book, but there's a way in which people are trying to shift the Aryan Jewish narrative in the Third Reich, are looking at American and colonial narratives of blackness and whiteness and trying to reposition Jewishness with whiteness to get the privilege of whiteness and escape the racialized burden of Jewishness in the Third Reich. So this film is one of several where I talk about this going on. And it's Reinhold Schunzel's Donegal Tonka from 1936. Reinhold Schunzel performed in and directed close to 150 films before the Nazis came to power. By the Nuremberg laws, he was a half-Jew who could not produce films without a special waiver. Yet, unlike other film professionals of Jewish descent, Schunzel did not emigrate immediately after the Nazi takeover. Given the forced talent drain from the German film industry and Schunzel's skill, popularity, and willingness to stay, the propaganda minister grudgingly granted studios permission to hire Schunzel one film at a time until he left for Hollywood in 1937. Sabine Hacke has written about how Schunzel's 1933 Victor Victoria, yes, that Julie Andrews movie is a remake of a Nazi film comedy, indirectly addresses the exclusion of Jews in the early Third Reich, Today, I argue that Donegal Tonka, another one of his films, represents another attempt by Schunzel to renegotiate the relationship between Jewishness and Nazism. In Donegal Tonka, a young French couple turns a fictional colony promoted by a con man, a dishonest academic, and an unscrupulous bank director into a successful gold-producing colony in South America. In the way it converts fraud into an economically productive settler colony, Donegal Tonka rehabilitates characters and behaviors coded as Jewish in a Nazi context and casts them as supporters and allies of white colonizers at the expense of brown colonial subjects. And you can already see this in this particular poster, right? You won't be surprised when I tell you that the couple on the left is the white French couple who, through their hard work, is going to create this colony, and that the dark, sinister fellows on the right are coded as Jews. And to get that colony finally elevated, you don't need just the white people, this film is going to say. You need the Jews working with the white people in order to colonize the brown world. So in order to be able to understand how Schunzel's film positions Jewishness in relationship to colonialism, it is helpful to understand some of the indirect and contextual ways the floating signifier of Jewishness functioned in the Third Reich. In the Nazi imaginary, Jewishness corrupted German culture from within and without. On the one hand, it adhered to the racialized bodies of people defined by the Nuremberg laws as Jewish and could be transmitted through blood and sexual contact. On the other hand, Jewishness was also construed as an abstract, free-floating spirit, detached from so-called Jews and infecting so-called Aryans and their culture. The Jewish spirit was spread not only by racial Jews, which are called black Jews, but also by corrupted Aryans known as white Jews. And these terms date back to the 19th century, and I just have a plate from the front of that book to show. It's an anti-Semitic tome from the early 19th century, the Jew School, or Basic Instructions on How to Become a Perfect Black or White Jew in a Short Time. So on the one hand, the concept of the black Jew, and this is referencing Africa, Africans, people of color, and this is part of in the racial sciences of the 19th century, what is wrong with Jews is that they have bred with these other bloodlines, right? But that you can still become one, and there's this tension in Nazi ideology that somehow it can be both. And this notion of white Jews, I think, I'm not going to read this whole quote, but I wanted to show you that it is a current notion in the Third Reich, and you can see it all over the place. Good Nazis calling other Aryans white Jews. And what it means is you're behaving like a Jew, which doesn't seem to make sense to those of us isolated from that context. And just to show that everyone did it, I'm quoting here from a Nobel laureate in physics who is very upset with the theoretical physicists who still believe Einstein, the relativity Jew. And so, yes, Einstein, the relativity Jew. And theoretical physics is too intellectual, too tied up in Jewish religious and Talmudic practices of interpretation. And only experimental physics is Aryan. Long rant. But the point is to say that these racialized discourses are moving in what we think of as strange and funny ways. But in general, what a white Jew is, I'm going to stick with that slide a little longer. The term white Jew is slippery, and it encompasses negative stereotypes and behavior that whoever was saying this term deemed Jewish. Generally speaking, Nazi-era anti-Semites affixed the label white Jew to Aryans who lacked enthusiasm for Nazi policies and who exhibited inflated self-worth, greedy business-oriented behavior, intellectualism and cunning, or undeserved influence over others. The anti-Semitic critique of the commercial mindset and greedy behavior of both black and white Jews was a primary feature of Nazi anti-capitalism. which I'm going here. This is a cartoon that I actually snagged off a neo-Nazi white supremacist website, but is from a Nazi publication, reminding us that these tropes of Jews as capitalist bankers are still very mobile and not just on the radical right. But in any case, Nazi anti-capitalism reflects tension. Now, Nazi is short, for those of you who are not Germanists here, for National Socialism. Nazi anti-capitalism reflects tensions in the party around economic policy and other ideological emphases, and in particular, racial anti-Semitism. In its early years, the Nazi Party, officially the National Socialist German Workers' Party, included strong socialist voices, and party leaders used strong anti-capitalist rhetoric long after they purged their party's socialist faction in 1934. In contrast to sustained anti-capitalist rhetoric, however, as the economic crisis caused by the Great Depression tapered off, the regime's actions favored private enterprise. For example, between 1935 and 1937, the Nazi regime reprivatized firms that had been nationalized in 1931 and 1932. There was substantial redistribution of wealth in the Third Reich, but property was not transferred on the grounds of class, but rather according to race. Jewish businesses were Aryanized, and Jewish people were forced to surrender their property, whether they were executed, deported, or able to emigrate. Despite struggles between more traditionally leftist socialists and the economic policies that emerged dominant in the party, the Nazi Party did not abandon anti-capitalism, albeit an inconsistent, contradictory, and in the words of Timothy Brown, essentially irrational and emotional anti-capitalism. As Brown describes, alongside the anti-capitalist theory of people such as Gottfried Feder, who distinguished between productive and exploitative, or Aryan and Jewish capital, and Otto Strasser, who likewise promoted racialized anti-capitalism, was a heartfelt rank-and-file anti-capitalism, fused in many cases with a thinly veiled class resentment, an emotive soldierly idea of socialism as a community of shared sacrifice, and a vague but powerful myth of the Volksgemeinschaft, the racial national community. Nazi anti-capitalism and socialism were predicated on anti-Semitism. Nazism conflated Jews and capital, proposing that the defeat of the former would lead to economic justice. Joseph Goebbels summarizes, as socialists, we are foes of Jews, because in the Hebrew, we see the incarnation of capitalism, that is, of the misuse of the people's goods. Once Marxists realized this, as pictured in the cartoon here, the Marxists would join the Nazis as brothers in a single Volk and crush the Jew beneath them. Such conflation of anti-capitalism and anti-Semitism, of the capitalist and the Jew, was very familiar to German film audiences in the 1930s. Due to the complex imbrication of anti-Semitism and anti-capitalism, economic critiques and fantasies are an important site of racialized discourse in Nazi cinema. Nazis accused Jews and their white Jewish prodigies of economic speculation that led to the hyperinflation of the early 1920s, the Great Depression, mass unemployment, and other German economic woes. Many capitalists, crooks, and speculators in comedies from the early to the mid-1930s should be interpreted in this context. While most such characters are portrayed negatively and excluded from the community and otherwise meet undesirable ends, Dangegut Tonka treats its white Jews differently, casting them in necessary supporting roles to help develop a lucrative, organized, and modern settler colony in South America. I don't think you can see that slide very well. Evan, how many minutes do I have left?
You are at 4 minutes.
Left?
Yeah.
Okay, so I won't describe the details of each of these characters that are coded as white Jews, but between them, you've got sort of a fraud psychoanalyst, and psychoanalysts, along with Freud, are just dirty, sex-obsessed Jews. You have a sick banker who's sexually, not literally ill, but harassing women. having this huge fraud where there is no colony, but he's collecting speculative money. You have a con man, basically crooks, psychoanalysts, dishonest academics, all inventing this colony. There's also really interesting coding here that has to do with North African names, Muslim locations. One of them is met in front of a mosque, and sort of this tying of the racial notion of that time of the Semitic to these characters. But we're going to blow through all of that, and I'm going to focus on Margayat. And Margayat is the most powerful white Jew in Donegal Tonka. Margayat happens to be the name of a Brazilian tribe, which has been used in French since the 19th century to signify both a scoundrel and a language that makes no sense, as in the American's expression of "it's Greek to me." So this name labels bank director Margayat as both foreign and dishonest. A rich banker, Margayat occupies an important profession in the anti-Semitic imaginary. One reviewer called him a larger-than-life shyster, using a word common during the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic and in Third Reich anti-Semitic, anti-capitalist rhetoric. Another critic made a more pointed reference to both hyperinflation and to anti-Semitic stereotypes, writing, "Involuntarily, one is reminded of the inflation era when operators had similar chutzpah. The use of the Yiddish word chutzpah, nerve, refers to the stereotypical Jewishness of Margayat's behavior. In the Nazi context, this word was racialized and functioned as anti-Semitic innuendo. Goebbels, for example, explained the word chutzpah, quote, as a typically Jewish expression that really cannot be translated into any other language, since chutzpah is a concept found only among the Jews. Other languages have not needed to invent such a word, since they do not know the phenomenon. Basically, it means unlimited, impertinent, and unbelievable impudence and shamelessness. And I dare you to Google Trump and chutzpah. Or read the conclusion of my book. But Margayat has power, money, and financial acumen, but no scruples. And he does horrible things that I don't need to list them all, but just trust me. He's really awful. But then your blonde Aryan hero comes in and decides he can't let all these poor people lose their money on a fake colony, so he's going to go to South America and make them all work hard and make working capitalism and a working economy based on labor, right? So labor and productivity are good Aryan capitalism in Nazi economic models. So he's able to sort of take exploitative Jewish capitalism and convert it into Aryan colonialist capitalism. So the right kind of capitalism, the right kind of racism, the right type of exploitation, rather than Jewish exploitation of white people. So I'll just jump to my final slide, which is Donegal Tonka is problematic for many reasons, including its support for colonialism and its fantasy of South America as a depopulated virgin landscape awaiting productive European colonizers. This is in line with Susanna Zantop's work on German colonial fantasies, but there are no Latin Americans in this movie. But in reconciling the Jewish with fantasies of Aryan colonialism, Schinzel's colonial fantasies also highlight the contradictions between the Nazi critique of capitalism and the Nazis' colonial ambitions, and the hypocrisy of both. Finance, capital, and investment are necessary for the colonial enterprise, which, if it succeeds, in Nazi terms, ultimately converts speculative or Jewish capital into productive or Aryan capital, and blurs the distinction between the two. Donegal Tonka highlights this process, showing how behaviors, characters, and capital coded and rejected as Jewish are in fact necessary to realize the Nazis' imperial ambitions.
Thank you, Valerie, and I'd like to thank the panelists for a round of great presentations. We have hit 2:46, and so now I'm going to ask for 5 minutes of overtime. I've been granted 5 minutes of overtime. Now we can have some questions. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to everyone for the presentations. I have a question for each of you. I'll try to be very short. Annie, for one of the questions, but maybe also for others here in the room at the moment, on presenting socialism and socialist countries as a sort of race-free space at the time, but obviously under communism there was the whole international, and there were people of color. I mean, let's not just coming to, whether it was Moscow to Budapest. And so is there studies on the experience of those communities? And I'm not aware as a lawyer not having, so I was curious about that, whether there's been work on that might break down a little bit like the work that you've been doing on, you know, looking at early at communities that have been there. For Ronald, very quick question. Is there any link between what you were saying on racial inclusiveness and diversity and linking it to attempts at combating sexual harassment on campus, sort of like the intersectional aspects? Has there been any links in trying also bringing these things together in a way? So that was just a curiosity. Last but not least, for Valerie, why are they using a French couple? Because the French weren't really the friends of the Germans at that time. It's all quite contrary. So it seems to be a little bit odd to, or maybe there's an explanation of linking that with the Aryan project. So that was my question.
Oh, very quick, yes. So I was referring to the assumptions, the kind of justification for not having to take into account colonialism and in any way juxtapose these pure lily white populations with post-colonial people of color. But of course, socialist internationalism included a great deal of networking at every level and exchanges, student exchanges in Germany, in the Soviet Union in the first place, and even in the smaller countries. Also in the later 80s, from the later 70s, from Arabic countries. So obviously these populations were visible, but almost entirely excluded and absolutely racially discriminated against. There is work on this, it's emerging. That's what I was referring to, the kind of everyday lives of socialism and the kinds of everyday and the kinds of structures of identity and politics that really have not been given too much attention because of the overwhelming focus on civil society, on the oppressive regimes versus intellectuals. So those binaries are now falling away a little bit and giving way to what actually happened, and racism is emerging as something that is just blinding, to use a very bad metaphor.
Yeah, I think that to the extent that we can take the narratives of individuals who have experienced oppression and sort of place those in relationship to one another through social media and through other kinds of resistance efforts, I think that there has been somewhat of a connection between the hashtag #MeToo movements and you know, similar movements that pertain to gender and sexual harassment, and that of those individuals who are talking about race and racism in the United States in particular. I can say that there has been that kind of connection. I don't know that there has been a sort of like, strong connection in terms of the social resistance efforts happening simultaneously on campuses in response to either racism or sexual harassment. I don't see them happening at the same time as ways to sort of compatibly try to address these oppressive regimes of truth.
Valerie, and then I've got a question from Cengiz, and then a question over there, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, the French. So I'll give the one shortest answer and then a slightly longer one is it's based on a French novel, but I think that's chosen intentionally. So in the Nazi racial sciences, the Mediterranean peoples, including the French, are above the Jews, but below the Aryans. But in the non-racial sciences, but still anti-Semitism dating back even further than the 19th century, there's a lot of slippage between Frenchness and Jewishness, and it's sort of through the concept of cosmopolitanism, which came up in your talk. But if you look at Wagner's Judentum in der Musik, for example, right, it's the French and the Jews who are globalizing culture in this way rather than keeping cultures national. It also goes back to the French Revolution. These liberal democracy ideas are so horribly Jewish too. They're trying to bring the weak up. So there's this alliance in a lot of Nazi film where French people stand in for Jews. Schunzel is trying to, again, like move Jews into whiteness in a certain way, So even though you have these very Aryan-looking French people, they're nevertheless French. They're not German, which is an irritant, as you're pointing out. And I would argue it could be part of the larger project of sort of showing how the Jews belong to the white side of the colonial equation.
My question will also, first of all, the quiz question. I was very, I would like to know who the Nobel laureate was, and I'm guessing it would have been Max Planck. Is that?
Johannes Stark.
Okay.
Ja,
Who
1922, glaube
called Einstein the...
Everyone was calling Einstein der Relativitätsjude. The article by Johannes Stark is in the Schwarze Chor, which is the SS newspaper, and it's called Weiße Juden in der Wissenschaft. And it's just a whole...
Exactly, which
Yeah.
brings me to my real question.
Okay.
There is a very intensive debate, though marginal now, in Germany. One female white German professor initiated a debate about the Jewish heritage in German legal academia. And I think it's a very interesting because she tested her students whether they know Jewish heritage in legal academia. And I didn't know up until then that until 45 or maybe 33, 1/3 of the law professors in Germany were Jews. And what happens today is something very, very weird, and I don't know how to think about it yet, but I feel like white, non-Jewish law professors reclaiming Jewish scholars, international law scholars, like Hans Kelsen and Jelinek, and much more other names, big names, and I feel very uncomfortable with it because they give us the feeling like they come, they're dealing with the past, but I would just argue if you really take it serious in an inclusive way, then talk about the Jews who are not here anymore, and not only the Jews, but also the other minorities, I think. So my question would be, if you have this number of 1/3 of the law professors being Jewish, and I think that makes the difference between anti-Semitism and other forms of racial discrimination, that the moment, the era when Jewish citizens were actually dispossessed and up until the extermination, they were quite well integrated in a society. So how do you deal with that if you compare the racial exclusion of the Jews with other racial exclusions?
Right, wow, that was like 5 different questions.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah,
And we're running over time, too.
right. Okay, so I could talk to you later about all the specifically German piece. I'll address the Jews, and I think a lot about this, because I think this is part of the problem why usually American conferences about race, the people talking about anti-Semitism aren't there, whereas all the Europeans who came here were, well, the racism is anti-Semitism. And I'm trying to, like, maybe this is a future book or whatever, think about Jewishness as a sort of situational whiteness, that there are different racial paradigms at work, as we've been talking about globally, and Jews move. So sometimes they're used as that buffer, right? So you can be almost white and stand between us, but at other times they're fully abject and you're ending up in concentration camps, right? And I think this, to really like open a powder keg is then also the problem of talking about Palestine, right? That if you look at race in only binaries, and you think, well, Jews are only on the one side or the other, you can often misrecognize whether you're victim or perpetrator, right? Or act as one. But if we can see race along more vectors than that, a sort of double the intersectionality, because there's still all the other intersectionalities, you can find a way of talking about Jewishness and anti-Semitism that's finds that way to talk about a minority that has achieved some success in a particular context. Yeah, but I haven't solved it. but I'm here to solve it.
Final question.
Real quick.
Yeah.
I guess my question is for you, Mr. Jackson. You talked a lot about educating and inclusive excellence and how we can incorporate, as professors or even, I would heard law students, so how we can learn that as well. But I guess my question is more of, at a certain age, I feel like a lot of these things are already implemented in practice, and so then how do we teach students that have maybe not been exposed to these things, or students that have already a set mindset, how do we get them to not only learn but then implement what is being taught in a more inclusive way? Because I feel like, I've worked at a university and one of our slogans was inclusive excellence, and I gave a lot of talks as like, here are the identities and things you should be aware of, and then people would leave and then practice something completely different. So I guess my question is how we could be effectively implement this.
Yeah, great question, and I think that there's a wide variety of ways to do that. It seems that if you are in a profession like law, where you have the opportunity to engage questions that are quite practical, that you can see happening in the communities across the nation and across the world, I think those are great sites to begin to do that kind of exploration, even if it's not happening in the actual classroom, and perhaps with the guidance of a professor. I think most professors that I've come across enjoy when their students are interested in learning more beyond the classroom, and if you're able to engage them and say, hey, here's some of the topics that I'm really interested in, where can I find information, how do I actually pursue this? I'm sure you get some support there. But you're right, I think that if it doesn't happen in the classroom, and that's kind of a point in some ways, that you have students that become less curious about those things because they feel like they've gotten what they need to move to the next level. And so oftentimes I've discovered that it happens just as they move forward in their careers and through life, they start coming against all kinds of modes of resistance and actually kind of uncover new insights, even as you're simply watching the news. You're like, whoa, I need to be trying to think about this. How do I pursue this particular line of thinking? But it is sort of like a lifelong educational venture, if you will. I think that's why we need to have the Academy do its work of trying to really expand and extend our lines of thinking around marginalized groups, so that they can actually see, oh, this is not just something that's on paper as a thought about a group that was acted upon, but rather here's individuals that are really contributing to the literature in meaningful ways. And so it's not always that they operate as object, they also can operate as subject and as agent. So anyhow, I'd love to talk with you further about that. I do have some resources in particular if you're interested, and we can move from there. But thank you for that question.
Thank you all for your attention, and thanks to the panelists for these wonderful insights.